Trouble is brewing in Algiers. Troops were out in the street of the city to deal with a demonstration by the OAS, the organization led by ex-General Salah. There's always the fear of another full-scale rising against President de Gaulle's Algerian policy, so no chances were being taken. On this occasion, there were clashes during the rioting, but order was eventually restored without bloodshed.
الجزائر نحن للمجد بلاد نحن آمل الجزائر في الليالي الحالكات نحن طلاب الجزائر نحن للمجد بلاد نحن آمل الجزائر في الليالي الحالكات كم غرقنا في دماء واحترقنا في حماة وعبقنا في سماء في عبير المواجهات نحن طلاب الجزائر نحن للمجد بلاد.
As the Algerian War neared the end of its 7th year, the attempts on de Gaulle's life increased, symptomatic of the accelerating violence. But they were not by France's Algerian opponents, the FLN, the Front de Libération Nationale, but by Frenchmen, principally the OAS, the Organisation Armée Secrète, the most die-hard of the bodies dedicated to keeping Algeria French. This latest attempt was made while de Gaulle was driving home to Colombey. The OAS slogan, the suitcase or the coffin, indicated the stark choice facing European settlers, to leave as refugees or as corpses. The OAS were angry because de Gaulle had begun negotiations with the FLN, while the FLN were furious that the negotiations were not going fast enough. They now openly demonstrated on the streets of Algiers, and however much the French army tried to curb them, their numbers and their enthusiasm showed which way the struggle was going. Ever since the dramatic show of Muslim solidarity during de Gaulle's visit the previous December, the European settlers had given up pretending that the FLN had little popular support. But while a political solution was being hammered out elsewhere, the French soldiers in Algiers were left to keep the peace. A thankless task, not without incident, as the distinguished reporter Robert Key found when visiting for BBC's Panorama.
French forces of order go into action against Arab nationalist demonstrators. The first ambulance is soon there too, in the courtyard of this vast apartment block in Algiers. The Arabs haven't tried to move off out of the courtyard, but the troops are seizing all nationalist flags and aren't particular how they do it. Perhaps there was someone behind that door, perhaps not. The Arabs keep their dead to themselves, and the French don't ask that sort of question. 4 dead was the official figure for that building. No one in Algeria believes official figures much. They see for themselves too often. This apartment block's nearest neighbors were less fortunate Arabs in a shanty town beside a cemetery. They too had soon raised the nationalist FLN flag. They too were well sealed off in their own quarters. The FLN, the nationalist organization, had given orders that demonstrations were to be peaceful and stay in their own quarters anyway. The French had given orders that there were to be no demonstrations at all. But Muslim feeling in Algiers runs high for independence, and the Arabs feel rightly that the forces of history, if not the French forces of order, are on their side. Shots were fired into the shanty town from an armored car, and troops moved in to break up the demonstrators and seize the nationalist flag. This, then, was how the 8th year of the Algerian War opened in Algiers. The European parts of Algiers were almost empty of traffic and shops were shut. The French secret organization of the army, sworn to keep Algeria French in defiance of General de Gaulle's self-determination policy, had given orders that there was to be no trouble. Only occasionally were these orders disobeyed, as here, where a stationer's shop was blown up by a plastic bomb because the stationer had refused to subscribe to OAS, the secret organization's, funds, and was suspected anyway of getting his own money out to France in preparation for a defeatist flight. The torn poster of General Salon, the OAS leader, was an almost sacred symbol to these crowds of young Europeans who seemed to be behind the OAS to a man and found the blowing up of the stationer's shop a great joke. The forces of order arrived to move them politely on. But it was in the Arab quarters, although well sealed off by barricades, that the real tension was felt that day. A tension which, however familiar in Algiers, is always sinister, always unpleasant. Europeans can never forget the cruel terror which the FLN nationalists unleashed on Algiers in the past. Understandably, perhaps they close their minds to all of the future except their fears, and they take no chances. Inside this barricade, on this 7th anniversary of the revolt, is a valley dominated by heights. In spite of all the show of force below, it isn't long before the cries of demonstrators waving flags are heard from the heights above. Once again, troops move off to break them up. But this time, something different happens. The height is crowned by a tall apartment building with people on the balconies. Suddenly, from the balconies, a shot rings out. The French lieutenant falls wounded. The patrol dives for cover below the road and then aims concentrated fire across the demonstrators at the face of the building. The lieutenant's wound is dressed while the firing continues. Suddenly, all is what in Algeria is called normal again. The firing ceases and the wounded are brought out, or some of them anyway, to be tended carefully by the ambulances of the people who wounded them. About 20 wounded are taken away. 2 people are said to have been killed. Not too bad an incident by the standards of Algeria. Fresh troops are brought up. The incident is in fact closed. The display of force somehow smothers all feeling, all need to sort out what had happened and why. Order is restored. The forces of order have done their duty. But they've been doing their duty now in Algeria for 7 long years, and Algerian Arab independence is closer than ever. Perhaps in their own interests, the French will one day learn that toughness, even in the face of provocation, is not enough.
The FLN leaders had first spurned de Gaulle's offer of negotiations in March 1961, because it wasn't clear he was proposing to deal with them alone. The revolt of the French generals had then delayed things, though it had also strengthened the FLN's hand, since the army's disarray ruled out a military solution, even if one had ever been possible in Algeria. Negotiations proper began at Evian on Lake Geneva in May 1961. Security was tight, since the OAS, in typical fashion, had shown what they thought of the proceedings by murdering Evian's mayor the previous month. There had been earlier contacts between the two sides, but they had been in secret. This time, the meetings were in the full glare of world publicity. Although the talks were held on French territory, the FLN delegation was housed across the lake. For the purpose, the Emir of Qatar had provided his Swiss retreat. It was a poignant moment for the French team, meeting for the first time, officially, the representatives of the most relentless rebellion France had ever faced, as the diplomat Bruno de Lys recalls.
We didn't consider them as enemies, for a very obvious reason. Because for us, Algeria was a part of France, not only as a territory, not only because on the maps, on the school maps, Algeria was painted in pink, as the French territory itself, metropole, but because, humanly speaking, we were so much accustomed to live together.
Nevertheless, the talks broke down, and the FLN leaders returned to Tunis. The stumbling block had been the Sahara, which the French were anxious to retain, arguing that Algeria had only ever meant the populous coastal strip. But it was clear that without the oil and gas and the atomic bomb test site there, the French would never have prolonged the war for acres of empty sand.
Probably it was doomed to failure because it was the first act of this tragedy. It was not possible as in a theater to reach the end in the first movement.
The Evian breakdown exasperated de Gaulle, particularly as the OAS bombers were wreaking such havoc within Paris. For the French, this was the last straw. De Gaulle was impatient to get on with rejuvenating France and was angry that the continuing war in Algeria prevented this. The OAS bombers played into the FLN's hands by weakening the French government's resolve. The FLN had just to sit back and leave the running to de Gaulle. After the putsch's failure, the OAS leader, General Salon, had gone to ground. Journalists tracked him down and asked him whether he would negotiate with the FLN.
Alors là, non, ne parlons pas de négociation. Non, je pense que l'exemple que nous leur montrons doit suffire à les rapprocher de nous.
Êtes-vous prête à négocier avec le général de Gaulle?
Non, je ne vais pas négocier avec le général de Gaulle. Le général de Gaulle s'est séparé de nous, c'est fini pour nous, le général de Gaulle. Il nous a trop triché, il nous a trop menti.
Despite his bluster, it was clear Salon had little support within mainland France for his views, and even less for his bombers' actions. Anti-OAS demonstrations were not just confined to the left. Thousands of ordinary Parisians took to the streets in protest when a bomb intended for de Gaulle's cabinet colleague, André Malraux, blinded instead a 4-year-old child. Many were surprised at how brutally the Paris police dealt with the demonstrators, leading to complaints that they were totally out of touch with the mood in France and had been infiltrated by OAS sympathizers. The most worrying incident was at the Charonne metro station, where 8 demonstrators, including 3 women, died.
Je suis descendue au métro Charonne. On m'a dit qu'il y avait une manifestation, les gens reculaient, il y avait déjà des blessés, des gens par terre, enfin tout ça. Plusieurs ont été écrasés sous le poids des grilles, enfin il y a eu des coups de matraque, des gens matraqués. On a transporté ces personnes sur le quai du métro Charonne. À ce moment-là, il y a eu des gaz lacrymogènes. Les gens, il y en avait un qui était pratiquement mort. On les a transportés du métro Charonne au métro Boulet-Montreuil, où on pensait que ça serait plus calme. On a essayé à ce moment-là d'appeler police secours, ou je ne sais pas, d'appeler quelqu'un. 1 heure après, exactement, quand ils sont arrivés, le docteur a déclaré une fracture du rocher, il n'y a plus rien à faire.
C'est le blessé qui vous parle. On ne sait jamais que la police taperait sur les gens qui sont contre l'OAS.
As well as the awful strife they were creating within France, where weariness with the war was only too obvious, the OAS incidents were having an effect on the FLN too, making them less intransigent. They feared that if de Gaulle were replaced, his successor might not be so accommodating. Also, men like Ben Khedda, the new FLN president, were aware of the terrible carnage the OAS were causing in Algeria among ordinary Muslims, fed up with the war too. Incredibly, the two sides were now being drawn together to face a common foe.
Sur la question fondamentale de l'avenir de l'Algérie, les points de vue français et algériens se sont rapprochés, donnant à une éventuelle négociation des bases plus précises et plus sûres. C'est dans ce contexte qu'on peut s'interroger si la procédure d'autodétermination n'est pas dépassée et s'il n'existe pas un chemin nouveau, plus court et plus aisé pour parvenir à la cessation des hostilités. Nous pensons, quant à nous, qu'il est possible aujourd'hui de promouvoir une solution rapide du conflit et qu'il existe, pour y parvenir, une méthode qui nous ferait aux uns et aux autres une économie de temps et de sacrifice et permettrait d'instaurer immédiatement la paix.
Les Rousses, a skiing resort in the Jura Mountains high above Geneva, some 20 or so miles away, and just half a mile from the Swiss border, was the place chosen for the further and hopefully final round of talks. They were to be held in secret, and despite the press's efforts, the location was never discovered, a garage building off the main Paris-Geneva road, housing snow-clearing equipment.
It was not a very large house, and there were on one side, we on the other side, with some weapons in between. And really, I would not say that there was a friendly atmosphere. No, it was not possible. But there was a very comprehensive on both parts atmosphere. Possibility to understand what the other side wanted, and really, the real work has been made at that time. Probably it is a better way to solve the problem, to force people living together without lunching with dining together, certainly not. But to force them, to give them a term for the work. And they knew perfectly well that after 5 or 6 days, it was very difficult to keep the meeting secret. So it was necessary to reach an agreement within this time of limit.
The real agreement had been reached at Les Rousses, away from the glare of publicity, though the I's were dotted and the T's crossed at a second Evian meeting in mid-March 1962. The FLN made a few concessions, but the biggest compromises were by the French, who yielded on the Sahara, rights of the European minority, and almost everything else, anxious that the war should be ended and the whole dreadful business put behind them. World opinion, as well as worry over the OAS attacks, had been pressing on de Gaulle.
En dépit de toutes les différences de race, de vie et de religion, il y a entre l'Algérie et la France non seulement les multiples liens tissés au cours des 132 ans de leur existence commune, non seulement les souvenirs des grandes batailles où les enfants des deux pays luttèrent côte à côte dans nos rangs pour la liberté du monde, mais encore une sorte d'attrait particulier et élémentaire. Qui sait même si la lutte qui se termine et le sacrifice des morts tombés des deux côtés n'auront pas en définitive aidé les deux peuples à mieux comprendre qu'ils sont faits, non pour se combattre, mais pour marcher ensemble sur la route de la civilisation.
Suddenly it was all over. At 12 noon on March 19th, 1962, both armies were ordered to cease fire. Parisians could hardly believe it. After 7.5 years of war, the bloodletting would now end. Or would it?
La conclusion du cessez-le-feu en Algérie. Les dispositions adoptées pour que les populations y disposent de leur destin. La perspective qui s'ouvre sur l'avènement d'une Algérie indépendante coopérant étroitement avec nous satisfont la raison de la France.
A Belgian film crew happened to be in Tunisia at that time and recorded for posterity the effect of the ceasefire announcement on the young FLN troops there, who had been trained for a war that thankfully they would not now have to fight.
Aujourd'hui, le cessez-le-feu est proclamé. Le cessez-le-feu n'est pas encore la paix. La paix n'est pas encore l'indépendance et l'indépendance n'est pas la révolution. C'est dire que la lutte continue, plus ample, plus complexe, plus subtile que jamais.
The FLN had got all that they had asked for in November 1954, full and complete independence over the entire territory of Algeria. For the French, though, relief rather than recrimination was the immediate feeling.
For the French, it was really the end of a drama, because Algeria was a part of France, because all the past was completely put away. Two, for the Algerians, they were now deeply concerned with the future of their own state. They have understood what was to lead and to lead a nation and a state.
One of the FLN's conditions for the ceasefire had been the early release after 5.5 years' captivity of the hijacked Ben Bella and his colleagues, who undoubtedly were going to play some role in the new state. Although never present, they had been wielding an influence on the negotiations. Many had put down the intransigence of the FLN to Ben Bella's imprisonment. The OAS's instant reaction was to call a general strike in Algiers, which ominously was total. What was worse, they declared that the enemy now was no longer just the FLN, but also the French army and the forces of law and order. Their aim was to nullify the Evian Agreement by proving that neither the French nor the Muslim Algerians could govern the country without the OAS's consent. Instead of being halted, the bloodshed was to increase. Indeed, Algiers was about to witness the most violent period of the whole war. While the barbed wire and body searches had so far been confined to the Muslim sectors of the city, it was now the European areas that took on the appearance of a battle zone. The OAS forbade all movement of Muslims outside their own quarters and enforced their will with indiscriminate killings. When these were extended to the gendarmes and the troops themselves, the army commander retaliated by laying siege to the European strongholds of the OAS. Not to be outdone, the settlers organized an ingenious supply chain to circumvent the army checkpoints and to feed the 60,000 or so inhabitants of Bab el-Oued, a working-class suburb of mostly poor whites, pieds noirs, who stood to lose most from an Algerian Algeria. It was clear that the OAS enjoyed massive support within European Algiers. When the OAS killings continued throughout the city, the army commander tightened his grip on the suburb, brought up 20,000 troops, complete with tanks and spotter planes, and even strike aircraft, and prepared to give battle. It was one of the most controversial and most criticized decisions of the whole Algerian struggle. The Battle of Bab el-Oued raged 3 days and cost the lives of 15 French soldiers as well as 20 European inhabitants. Scores were wounded, many of them seriously. Thousands more were arrested. Big caches of weapons, especially bombs, were discovered.
Habitants de Bab el-Oued, les événements du 23 mars prouvent que l'armée et toutes les forces de l'ordre iront sans restriction ni réserve jusqu'au bout de leur devoir. Vous connaissez les garanties qui vous sont assurées. Mettez fin au combat fratricide. Rendez les armes et cessez le combat.
But it wasn't over by any means. A massive wreath-laying ceremony was organized by the OAS at the War Memorial to protest at the Bab el-Oued dead. Boasting that 500,000 would turn up, they prompted the authorities to ban it, which was to invite a confrontation. Algiers was to see the biggest concentration of gendarmes and riot police since the Muslim backlash of December 1960. The crowds would not disperse and instead hung around checkpoints that had been strategically placed across many of the main thoroughfares, as though waiting and hoping for the action to begin. More and more people kept arriving, wanting to force their way through to the War Memorial. Further police reinforcements were hurried to the scene. But still, the crowds kept coming. When the police found they couldn't cope, once again troops were called in. But this time they were not to be the combat-trained forces who had faced the OAS at Bab el-Oued. Tear gas grenades hurled from helicopters failed to disperse the crowds. The police were clearly relying on the soldiers, but they were units fresh from the outback, mostly young Muslim Algerians who had backed the French, and in the changed circumstances were now worried about their own future. Nervous and anxious, they were totally unsuited for a situation that demanded tact and experience. Taunted by the hostile Europeans and out of their element in city streets, they were a prey to provocation. Suddenly, from a rooftop came gunshots. Without waiting for orders, they began firing recklessly all around them. The mob panicked and tried to escape the bullets, but in vain. People were cut down as they ran. The death toll was appalling. When all was over, 46 bodies were counted, and more than 200 wounded, many of them seriously, had been carried away. At least 20 of these were to die later. Nearly 2,000 spent cartridges were found in the roads around. If the OAS had wanted a spectacular massacre, they had certainly got one. Maintaining law and order in Algiers during the run-up to the referendum in July, which would pronounce one way or the other on the Evian Agreement, was going to be a grim business. The OAS recruited its killers not just from the militant Pieds Noirs who had manned the barricades during the abortive revolt of January 1960, but also from the many legionnaires and paratroopers who had deserted the army following the failed putsch of the year before. Indeed, the organizational brains came from the colonels and captains who had also absconded then. The political inspiration, however, stemmed from the ultras, for whom an Algerian Algeria was anathema, and those senior officers who thought decolonization an international communist plot. That said, OAS certainly attracted all the psychopaths, pathological dropouts, sadists, thugs, and cookie characters that had clustered round the honeypot of wartime Algiers. The near anarchy of its command structure was an open invitation to settle old scores under the guise of pseudo-political action. The OAS were not too fussy as regards targets. When they weren't killing people, the daily average in Algiers alone was 30 to 40, mostly Muslims, with the occasional moderate Pieds Noirs thrown in for good measure. They were blowing up hospitals, clinics, schools, banks, prisons, libraries, garages, shops, factories, town halls, laboratories, small businesses, large businesses. You name it, they destroyed it. Their grisly work was financed by bank robberies in both France and Algeria, contributions from rich colons, levies on companies operating or trying to operate in the country, and fines on poorer Pieds Noirs for such offences as going abroad on holiday. The total of these funds must have been considerable, and what happened to them afterwards remains a mystery, like that of the FLN treasury, secreted in Swiss bank accounts, whose numbers were known only to a discreet few, many of whom were to meet violent deaths in strange circumstances in the years to come. Socially, Algiers was dead. OAS had seen to that. But so had the presence of troops. Few cinemas or cafes remained open at night. Even during the daytime, no one lingered to gossip anymore. Wives would become frantic if husbands were merely minutes late returning home. Friends were not trusted. Neighbor suspected neighbor. Europeans and Muslims no longer mingled. The two communities were now irretrievably divided.
Tout naturellement, à la fin du putsch, certains camarades se sont rendus au général de Gaulle. Moi, j'ai refusé. Il était absolument exclu que je me rende jamais à cet homme. Bon. Et après un mois ou un mois et demi de réflexion, j'ai décidé de travailler dans le cadre de l'OAS. Une organisation comme celle-là, clandestine, révolutionnaire, ne peut utiliser que la violence. On en a 1000 preuves aujourd'hui dans tous les pays du monde. Lorsqu'une minorité se trouve brimée par le gouvernement, eh ben, elle agit automatiquement par la violence. Il y a des actions de l'OAS que je réprouve, mais on ne fait pas d'omelette sans casser des œufs. Et ce que je trouve inadmissible, c'est que on nous accuse, nous, l'OAS, d'avoir utilisé la violence, on nous condamne pour avoir utilisé la violence, alors que, par exemple, les Irlandais utilisent, les mouvements irlandais utilisent la violence depuis je ne sais pas combien d'années, infiniment plus que l'OAS contre le gouvernement britannique. Et il y a des tas de pays qui l'approuvent. Et non seulement en Irlande, mais un peu dans tous les pays du monde.
Ceux qui ont combattu dans les rangs de l'OAS, dans leur immense majorité, étaient guidés par le culte de l'honneur, de la parole donnée, et aussi, d'une manière plus générale, par l'amour désintéressé de la patrie. Pour eux, l'insurrection était le plus sacré des devoirs.
Elle s'appuyait sur une population de pieds noirs qui était vraiment de très bonne foi. La population était de bonne foi. On lui avait jamais dit que l'Algérie n'était pas française. Elle le croyait. Par conséquent, elle était trompée par tout le monde, cette population. Et c'était bien dommage, parce que c'était des gens qui étaient malheureux, tout simplement. Et au lieu de se battre jusqu'au bout, comme l'OAS l'espérait, ben, petit à petit, ils sont partis. Ils ont été neutralisés, ils ont compris, les familles se vidaient, le mari restait pour travailler, mais la femme et les enfants repartaient quand ils pouvaient. Et puis il y a eu l'exode du mois d'avril et du mois de mai qui ont été des exodes gigantesques, si bien qu'il ne restait plus rien. Alors cette OAS qui était devenue squelettique au moment où elle faisait le plus de ravages, parce qu'elle était squelettique, mais elle faisait des attentats extraordinaires, au point que nous avions été obligés avec le délégué général de mettre dans des camps de concentration les jeunes à qui on donnait des armes, parce que l'OAS donnait des 11-43 à des jeunes de 16 à 20 ans, et leur disait, il faut tuer 10 musulmans, n'importe lesquels, dans la rue. Voilà comment ça se passait au mois de mai.
C'était une période très difficile, une période où tout le monde était très engagé, et dans ces périodes-là, il y a la violence, et la violence est de toutes parts.
OAS sympathizers and OAS killers bent over backwards to try to justify their actions at this time. But there was no doubt it was mindless murder, blind, indiscriminate bloodletting.
Il y a eu la journée des facteurs, par exemple. Ils tuaient tous les facteurs musulmans qu'ils rencontraient. On donnait une arme à des enfants de 18 ans, il fallait tuer les facteurs. Une autre fois, les femmes de ménage. Une autre fois, il fallait tuer les pharmaciens, etc. Donc le terrorisme a pris des formes gigantesques. Alors là, je tiens à signaler une chose qu'on n'a pas dit toujours, n'est-ce pas? C'est que le nombre d'attentats OAS en 6 mois, pendant que j'étais préfet de police à Alger, à l'époque où j'étais plus longtemps que ça, mais dans les 6 mois, c'est-à-dire de décembre à juin, de décembre 61 à juin 62, a été 4 fois plus important que le nombre des attentats du FLN en 6 ans.
The OAS period was a very crazy period. It was also a very brutal period because the OAS was indulging in a very nasty war between the so-called barbouzes, the people who'd been sent by the Gaullist regime to eliminate the OAS, and who very soon got eliminated by the OAS itself. And there were very strange and terrifying things that one would see. For instance, I remember at the height of the OAS action in Algiers, going to Belcourt, and there seeing the corpse of a Vietnamese secret agent, Barbouz, hanging from a tramway line.
L'OAS était obligé de procéder quelquefois à des exécutions parce qu'une discipline, ça s'impose. Et ça ne s'impose pas autrement que par la violence, hein, dans des périodes comme ça.
They killed people, I would say, almost indiscriminately. One of the most ghastly things that I remember of that whole period was a mortar shelling of perfectly innocent Algerian civilians on what was then called the Place du Gouvernement near the Casbah. And I just happened to be within 50 yards of it happening, grabbed a photographer who was then at the Hotel Leti. We rushed back. We went to the main hospital where they were being given first aid. And I remember being inside a ward and watching all these people, many of them dying and hideously injured, and listening, eavesdropping on a conversation between doctors, medical students, nurses, and realizing to my horror that one of the doctors had in fact taken part in the attack. So that was the kind of war it was.
There were
effectively three governments. There was the official government, which went through the motions of governing, but really, apart from supervising the clearing up of the rubbish and that sort of thing, really had no authority at all. And in the Arab areas, a great deal of policing done with the same sort of vigor that the IRA now exercises in its kneecapping operations in Northern Ireland. Very effective they were. And the OAS and their military deserters in parts of the certainly working class colon areas of the city.
Political assassinations were a dime a dozen. There was a kind of ugliness where people were, the Europeans were shooting Muslims and just covering them over with newspapers.
The OAS had deliberately set out to perpetrate such appalling atrocities on the Arab population that they would provoke the Arab population into hitting back. The object of that exercise was perfectly simple and straightforward. They wanted to destroy the Evian Accords, which were leading straight to independence, and force the French army back into the field against the FLN and bring the whole enterprise of moving to independence to a halt. So that these absolutely dreadful atrocities were not just the result of pathological murderers, although God knows there were plenty of those about, but the actual deliberate policy of the very senior French ex-army officers who were in charge of the OAS. It was an outrage.
The intelligence of those operations, the precision of what the OAS was doing, what they were blowing up, their ability to strike with impunity, obviously meant that the very important parts of the army were feeding them information and allowing them to pass through roadblocks, the whole works.
The most terrible one of all, I suppose, was a case in which an OAS squad had detected what it believed to be a hospital catering for FLN wounded. Whether that was the case or not, we never discovered, but there certainly weren't all FLN in that hospital, and they blew it up. And after the dust had settled, they went into the hospital and machine-gunned the people in their beds, the survivors. And that was the sort of thing that was intended to cause such outrage in the Casbah and other areas like that, that it would lead to a mob running wild with meat hooks in the way that they did some years earlier.
The OAS attacks, even by their own standards, were becoming ever more desperate, symptomatic of the fact that for some weeks now they had been without any real leaders. General Jouot, Salon's number 2, had been arrested in late March. Roger de Gaulle, who headed the Delta Commandos, the most deadly gang of OAS killers, had been captured in mid-April. Later that same month, Salon himself had been caught. The blowing up of the BP oil storage unit at Oran was the OAS's last fling. Both Salon and Jouot from the mainland prisons had been persuaded to help end it all. Even so, with just a couple of weeks to go to the referendum, on June 17th, Algiers, France, and indeed the interested world was flabbergasted to learn that a truce had been negotiated between the OAS and the FLN. It began to look as if the war, at long last, was truly over.
Armée secrète vous parle. À partir de ce soir minuit, de suspendre les combats et d'arrêter les destructions.
Au début de la guerre, il était peut-être possible qu'une solution soit trouvée et que les Européens restent en Algérie. Mais à la fin de la guerre, avec les exactions de l'OAS, qui semblait, en fait, l'organisation de l'armée secrète semblait avoir un consensus général, il n'était plus possible que les Européens restent en Algérie. Les accords d'Évian, les Algériens, le gouvernement français, tout prévoyait que les Français puissent continuer à vivre dans une Algérie indépendante. Mais il y a eu de tels drames, de telles tragédies dans les derniers mois de la guerre d'Algérie que la communauté européenne dans son ensemble a pensé que ce n'était plus possible, qu'il y aurait des vengeances, et progressivement, elle a quitté son pays, dans la mesure où, pour certains, il y avait peut-être un risque, et pour d'autres, il y avait un complexe de culpabilité, une très grande amertume en réalité pour tout le monde. Et je crois que l'OAS porte une très lourde responsabilité pour ce qui concerne le départ des Français d'Algérie.
Burning furniture now took the place of burning buildings as the Pieds Noirs prepared to quit, preferring to put to the torch what they could not take with them, rather than leave it for the Muslims. It was the same with their cars. Some solved the problem by simply pushing them off cliffs into the sea. All traces of the terrible struggle were soon cleared from the streets, as the Muslims prepared for the referendum that would ratify their independence. It was a far less sinister kind of graffiti that now put in an appearance. Three days after the ceasefire, the curfew that had been Algiers' way of life for so long was at last lifted. Mainland France had already pronounced on the Evian Agreement to the tune of a massive 90% yes vote. The Muslim turnout and support in Algeria was to be in excess of that. One of the biggest and most extraordinary population movements in modern history was taking place. The Pieds Noirs, after 132 years, were leaving Algeria en masse. Not in the few thousands that Paris had expected and the Evian Agreement had provided for, but in their hundreds of thousands. And nothing that the authorities could say would reverse the flow. It wasn't just the rich colons who were pulling out, nor simply the OAS diehards, but ordinary citizens, poor whites, who were most vulnerable to Muslim competition for their jobs. By the end of the summer, suburbs like Bab el-Oued would be empty and dead. By the end of the year, there would be only 30,000 Europeans left in the whole of Algeria, compared to the million plus there at the beginning.
You don't have to be right morally or historically to really suffer very deeply. I think the Pieds Noirs, historically, they were wrong. Morally, at the time of the OAS, they were wrong. But their suffering in the Exodus was real.
The people responsible for the ultimate misery of the colon were the OAS by their very tactic of trying to outrage the Arab population. They made the colons so petrified of the consequences of staying after independence that they just had to leave. And there were really quite harrowing scenes at the airport towards the end, people trying to get on the planes. And some people making a very good living out of black markets and tickets onto airplanes and things like that. It was really a very weird scene.
No one imagined how massive the exodus would be. 350,000 European settlers left Algeria in June, the month of the OAS-FLN ceasefire. 100,000 had already quit in the weeks before, despite threats of reprisal from the OAS. Another 500,000 were to depart before the year was out. The Suitcase was taking preference over the Coffin. Shopkeepers sold off their wares for whatever they could get, and then simply closed their doors forever. Bars and cafes, favored by the Pieds Noirs for generations, changed hands at knockdown prices. Teachers, doctors, nurses, policemen, engineers, lawyers, a whole professional class quit, just like that. Some drove via Morocco to Spain with their belongings, but most left by ship or plane. Officially, they were allowed only to take 2 suitcases each, but many seemed to smuggle out much more. Virtually the whole of Algeria's 200,000-strong Jewish community upped and left, mostly to France, which was the destination of the majority of the Pieds Noirs. though it was a country many of them had never set foot in. Sizable groups did find their way to Canada, Israel, and even Argentina, as well as Spain. The numbers that made it to France were enough to fill the mainland's two biggest cities after Paris, Lyon and Marseille. The moderates among the Muslims were saddened at the extent of the exodus, but not the FLN hardliners, who had already decided that there was no place in their Algeria for the Pieds Noirs. Once the Pieds Noirs had gone, there were some pickings for their Muslim neighbors. Less lucky were those Muslim soldiers who had backed France. Of the 250,000 who had done so, only 15,000 escaped.
Ces hommes, ces musulmans sont des Morasnis. Ils faisaient partie de l'armée française et étaient chargés d'assurer la sécurité des sas. Que vont-ils devenir maintenant? C'est la question qu'ils posent à leur lieutenant et à laquelle ce dernier ne sait pas encore répondre, d'où son trouble.
Qu'est-ce que vous comptez faire? Rien. Je suivrai l'armée jusqu'à ce qu'ils me disent de la quitter. Et alors, qu'est-ce que vous ferez à ce moment-là? Ben, je sais pas. Ben, une fois que je serai entre les mains.
Philippeville, à côté de Philippeville, qui est un port du Constantinois, il y avait une SAS, section administrative spécialisée, et dont l'unité de police et d'intervention était ce qu'on appelait un Marzen. Marzen, c'est une troupe auxiliaire musulmane entièrement. Et le Marzen, on dit aussi les goumiers, vous avez entendu les deux termes. Les goumiers de la SAS de Mareuil étaient des gens qui étaient très pour la France et qui avaient agi énergiquement sur leurs compatriotes. Bien entendu, au moment où l'Algérie est devenue indépendante, leurs officiers les ont amenés sur un bateau. Ils ont monté en rade de Philippeville sur un bateau pour aller en France. Il était évident qu'on ne pouvait pas les laisser là-bas. Un officier Félaga est venu. Il a exigé qu'il soit redescendu du bateau. Et il a obtenu que le général commandant le corps d'armée donne l'ordre aux militaires français de redescendre des goumiers sur le port. Oui, c'est horrible, c'est comme ça. Et ces gens-là ont hurlé, ont crié, ont supplié, ils s'accrochaient à tout ce qu'ils pouvaient trouver. Les forces françaises ont retrouvé de l'énergie, une énergie qu'ils avaient perdue depuis le putsch, pour les jeter en dehors du bateau. Et ces gens-là ont été assassinés, égorgés, sur la place de Marquet à Philippeville, à 150 mètres du bateau qu'on les avait obligés à quitter.
Clearly, the plight of their Muslim brothers who had fought against them was not uppermost in the minds of Ben Bella and the other FLN leaders, as they met their army for the first time since their release from 5.5 years of French captivity. They could reflect that de Gaulle and his government had expressed little concern either for the 100,000 or so Arki who died in the bloody aftermath of the Algerian War. Theirs is a story of which no one can be proud. And the men who took part in the putsch of April 1961, however muddled their motives might have been, have a point when they draw attention to it. But Ben Bella and Co.'s thoughts at this moment were on the political struggle ahead for control of their country.
War-ravaged Algiers was jubilant to the point of hysteria. By a 201 majority, the referendum had declared for independence, and 132 years of French rule was over. The rejoicing went on through the night. Even in Algiers, the jubilation may have been premature. Ben Khedda, provisional governor-premier, was hero of the hour, but his rival, Ben Bella, says he commands the allegiance of 10,000 troops. Not even yet is it peace in Algeria.
The new nation of Algeria was truly launched. For the people in those first hours of independence, the possibility of further strife must have seemed remote. Now is the time to remember the million of their countrymen who had died that they might enjoy this moment. It was also the occasion for sober reflection on the outcome.
Joy, satisfaction, and at the very beginning, I would say 20 years ago, it was fear of having to face the building of a nation, which is more difficult than fighting for independence, in my view.
Avec mes souvenirs
souvenirs. J'ai allumé le feu, mes chagrins, mes plaisirs. Je n'ai plus besoin de balayer mes amours avec leur trémolo, balayer pour toujours. Je repars à zéro. Non, rien de rien. Non, je ne regrette rien, ni le bien qu'on m'a fait, ni le mal, tout ça m'est bien égal. Non, rien de rien. Non, je ne regrette rien, car ma vie, car mes joies, aujourd'hui, ça commence avec toi.
إن قدوة للسائلين كم عصفنا بالجبابر سل شعوب الأرض عنا كم صرانا الظالمين واحتكمنا في المصائب نحن بلغنا الرسالة نحن صدرنا العدالة نحن حطمنا الجهالة وصدعنا الظلمات نحن بلغنا الرسالة نحن صدرنا العدالة نحن حطمنا الجهالة وصدعنا الظلمات نحن طلاب الجزائر نحن للمجد هنا كم غرقنا في دماء واحترمنا في حماه وعبرنا في سماه في عبير المهجات نحن طلاب الجزائر نحن للمجد هنا